There was a time when Evan believed that love meant giving everything: time, energy, presence, patience. That belief was never tested more than in his relationship with Maya. She was magnetic in a way that made people lean in just to feel the warmth of her attention. And Evan had been no different. At 42, Evan looked back on the man he was during those early days, hopeful, eager to nurture something real, and almost didn't recognize himself. Maya was 38 when they first met, all wild laughter and spontaneous energy. She had this chaotic charm, the kind that swept into a room and left people rearranging themselves to orbit her. Evan found it intoxicating. At first, in the beginning, Maya's storms were rare. A teary call after a long day at work, an anxious night after an argument with a friend. Evan would drop everything, cancel meetings, lose sleep, change plans, just to be there. He'd learned how to decode her moods, how to soothe the panic beneath her surface. He felt important, needed. He once drove through a snowstorm because she said she just couldn't be alone. That night, she greeted him in tears, collapsed into his arms, and fell asleep on his chest without another word. Evan stayed the whole night, even though he had to be up early the next morning for a crucial presentation. He gave. He always gave. At first it felt noble. He told himself that this was what love required, that Maya needed someone to steady her in a world that often left her spinning. He played therapist, cheerleader, safe harbor. He was proud of how he showed up. Maya would often look at him with those glassy, grateful eyes and whisper, "I don't know what I'd do without you." And Evan believed it. He clung to those words during the hard times. When her breakdowns became more frequent, more volatile, when her gratitude began to feel performative, when her crises arrived like clockwork, often timed to coincide with moments when Evan had something important of his own. An event, a trip, a chance to step away and breathe. Still, he stayed. He started bending around her moods, second-guessing his own feelings to make room for hers. If she cried, he was there. If she yelled, he listened. If she vanished into silence, he sat outside her emotional walls, waiting to be let back in. Each time he sacrificed his peace, he called it compassion. He told himself this is what it meant to be a good man, a supportive partner. But something inside him was quietly cracking. It wasn't just the exhaustion, though that was ever present. It was the realization that Maya's needs weren't temporary storms. They were a system, a cycle, one that required Evan's constant fuel to keep turning. The more he gave, the more it demanded. And in his most private thoughts, Evan began to wonder, was this love, or was this manipulation, wearing the mask of need? It didn't happen all at once. If it had, Evan might have walked away sooner. But like most toxic patterns, it crept in slowly, dressed as vulnerability, disguised as love. Maya's breakdowns began to arrive with an almost uncanny precision, always when Evan was inching towards something that resembled personal fulfillment. When he got promoted and needed to prepare for an important conference, Maya had a panic attack. She called him, breathless and weeping, saying she didn't feel safe alone. That she thought she was having a heart attack. Evan left his notes scattered on the dining table and drove across the city to hold her hand while she recovered. She was smiling by the time he arrived. "You always know how to calm me down," she whispered, nuzzling into his chest like nothing had happened. He missed the conference call. When he tried to reconnect with his old college friends, people who reminded him of who he was before the emotional weight of the relationship, Maya got into a fight with her sister, then claimed she was completely broken. Evan canceled the reunion and spent the evening listening to her sob about how no one in her life understood her. He poured wine, sat on the couch, and let her vent. She clung to him like a life raft. At first, Evan chalked it all up to coincidence. Life was messy, unpredictable. People had hard times, and he wanted to be the kind of man who didn't flinch in the face of emotional complexity. But after a while, the chaos started to follow a pattern. Maya's emotional spirals seemed less like uncontrollable events and more like carefully timed performances, and Evan was the audience she depended on. He noticed that the severity of her emotions often increased in direct proportion to his distance, emotional, physical, or even mental. If he was busy, distracted, or simply unavailable, a crisis would erupt. She needed him not just present, but entirely devoted. And when he was, the drama would swiftly dissolve, as if it had never existed in the first place. That inconsistency disturbed him. Maya always framed her breakdowns as raw authenticity, as a deep emotional sensitivity the world was too cruel to accept. She wore her wounds like a badge of honor. "I just feel more deeply than other people," she'd say. "Most can't handle that." But Evan began to realize she never took responsibility for the pattern she repeated. Her pain was always someone else's fault. Her exes were toxic. Her family didn't care. Her coworkers were cruel. The world was always doing something to her, and Evan was expected to be the balm, the fix, the cure. Whenever he expressed a need of his own, some space, a moment of rest, a conversation about boundaries, Maya would twist it. She'd accuse him of being distant, cold, uncaring. She'd cry and say she felt abandoned, that he was just like the others who didn't get her. Evan would backpedal, reassure her, apologize for trying to draw a line. His boundaries dissolved under the weight of her reactions. Over time, Evan stopped bringing up his feelings. He learned that any attempt at asserting his own emotional needs would be reframed as an attack on hers. So he swallowed his frustration, suppressed his exhaustion, and convinced himself that maybe this was just what love looked like. Maybe he was the one who needed to change, to grow more patient, more resilient. But the truth was harder to admit. Maya wasn't just emotionally reactive, she was emotionally strategic. And the more Evan pulled away, the harder she clung, always with a fresh breakdown, a new crisis, a dramatic gesture that pulled him back in. One night, she showed up at his apartment doorstep sobbing, saying she couldn't breathe, that she thought she might hurt herself. Evan stayed up all night watching her sleep on his couch, terrified to close his eyes. The next morning, she made pancakes and acted like nothing happened. That was the moment something inside him cracked. He realized then that he was no longer responding to Maya from a place of love, but from a place of obligation and fear. Not fear for her, but fear of what would happen if he didn't respond. Fear of being cast as the villain in her next emotional narrative. Fear of what part of himself he'd lose if he kept pretending this was okay. He had become an emotional caretaker, not a partner. And Maya, whether consciously or not, had learned how to keep him locked in that role. She didn't need a relationship, she needed an audience. And Evan was beginning to understand that love was not about endless empathy without reciprocity. It wasn't about absorbing someone else's chaos just to prove you care. What he once thought were cries for help were, perhaps, just calls for control. The day that shifted everything didn't begin with an explosion. There were no slammed doors, no late-night shouting matches. It started quietly, like most real transformations do, with Evan sipping black coffee at his kitchen table, staring at a message from Maya that simply read, "I'm not okay. I need you." He stared at the screen for a long moment. There was no dramatic punctuation, no excessive emojis, just a short plea that, once, would have set him into motion, like a fire alarm. He would have thrown on a jacket, canceled his morning meetings, driven through traffic just to reach her. But this time, something inside him paused. He didn't move. It wasn't indifference. He still cared, at least on some level. It wasn't cruelty either. It was clarity, a strange, cold quiet that settled into his chest and whispered, "You've been here before. And you know exactly how this will go." Maya would be sobbing when he arrived. She would cling to him, speak in half-coherent sentences about someone's betrayal, or some fear that had spiraled out of control. And Evan would do what he always did. Listen, hold her, try to fix what was broken, only to find himself emotionally depleted once again. But he was tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the soul-deep fatigue that comes from caring too hard for too long without receiving anything in return. He looked out the window and watched the morning light spill across the pavement. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to do nothing. Maya sent a second message an hour later. "I'm falling apart. Still, he didn't reply. He could feel the anxiety rising in his chest, the old urge to jump into action. But this time he examined it instead of obeying it. Was this love or programming? Was his instinct to help really about compassion? Or was it about guilt, fear, and the silent pressure she'd trained into him over time? Later that afternoon, Maya showed up unannounced at his place. Evan answered the door calmly, still dressed in his casual clothes, still carrying the strange sense of distance he hadn't yet let go of. Her mascara was smudged, her hair tangled, her expression one of utter despair. But Evan didn't flinch. He didn't widen his arms to catch her. He didn't say, "What happened?" or, "I'm here for you." He stepped aside and let her in, quietly, wordlessly. Maya collapsed onto his couch and started crying. Loudly, desperately. But this time Evan didn't rush to sit beside her. He didn't kneel down to meet her eye level. He didn't ask questions or offer affirmations. He just stood there, arms crossed, watching her with a gaze not of judgment, but of exhaustion. She looked up at him through teary eyes, waiting for the reaction she was used to. The softening of his face, the panic in his voice, the outstretched hand. None came. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said between sobs. "I feel like I'm losing everything." "Do you?" Evan asked, his voice low, even. "Yes," she cried, almost louder, like she was dialing up the emotion in hopes of pulling him closer. "I feel like I'm drowning." Evan nodded slowly, still unmoved. "And what are you doing to swim?" Maya blinked. That wasn't the response she expected. She sat up slightly, visibly thrown off by his detachment. "What do you mean? I need help." "You always need help, Maya," Evan replied, "and I've always been the one to give it, but you never actually do anything to help yourself." Her lip trembled. "That's not fair." "No," he said, voice steady. "What's not fair is giving everything I have, over and over, while being made to feel guilty the one time I pause to take care of myself. What's not fair is being turned into an emotional punching bag because you refuse to face your own chaos." The words weren't shouted. They weren't even particularly cruel. But they were honest, and Maya's silence afterward told him just how much the truth pierced through. "I love you," she whispered, almost as a last resort. Evan looked at her, not coldly, but with the kind of compassion that no longer equaled surrender. That's not what love looks like. It was the moment he realized he no longer feared her storms. Her tears didn't have the same grip on him. The knots she used to tie around his empathy were unraveling. He was no longer the same man who'd rushed to fix her. He had learned the cost of caring without, balance of pouring from a cup that never got filled back. "I'm not your safety net anymore," he said simply. Maya sat back on the couch, stunned. It was the first time in their entire relationship she couldn't break him open with emotion. She looked at him as if seeing a stranger. In truth, Evan wasn't a stranger. He was just someone who had finally reclaimed himself. And in that moment, with no yelling, no grand declarations, no dramatic exits, the real shift occurred. He didn't slam the door. He didn't kick her out. He just walked into the other room, poured himself a glass of water, and reclaimed his space. Maya sat there waiting for the man she used to know to come rushing back. But he didn't, and for the first time, she understood. She could no longer reach him. Evan hadn't stopped caring. He had simply stopped sacrificing himself to prove it. The silence that followed Maya's breakdown wasn't loud or painful. It was peaceful. For the first time in a long time, Evan felt no urgency to fix anything. He sat on his balcony that evening with a glass of bourbon, watching the sun dip behind the horizon, and realized something profound. He no longer lived in emotional survival mode. The chaos had always followed Maya. But the need to run toward it, that had been his. Now he let it pass like a storm outside someone else's window. Maya stayed quiet for a few days after her outburst. No texts, no calls, no theatrics. Evan didn't chase the absence. He didn't sit by the phone or scan his inbox for her name. Instead, he returned to his own rhythm, the one he had long abandoned to orbit around her emotional moons. He started waking up early again, not because he had to take care of anyone, but because he wanted to sit in the stillness of his apartment before the world stirred. He went to the gym without leaving a note, cooked meals without worrying if she'd criticize them, and even began reading again, something he hadn't had the mental energy for in years. The novel on his nightstand had gathered dust during his relationship with Maya. Now it sat open, with a bookmark moving further each night. When Maya eventually reached out, it was a voice note, fragile, almost childlike. I miss you. I feel like I messed everything up. Please call me. I need you. Evan played the message once, then again, and then deleted it. It wasn't bitterness guiding him. It wasn't revenge. It was simply clarity. He could finally hear the weight behind her words, not in what she said, but in what she always expected them to do. She didn't want connection. She wanted reaction. Her needs were never presented as requests, but as emergencies that demanded full surrender. And he had learned that not every cry deserves a rescue. When they did eventually meet again, it was by chance. A small bookstore downtown, the kind with uneven floors and creaky shelves. Evan was browsing a poetry section when he looked up and saw her. Maya looked thinner, somehow smaller, like the gravity she used. To exude had dimmed. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and she approached with hesitant excitement. Hey, she said, brushing her hair behind her ear like it was any other day. Hey, Evan replied, calm, unreadable. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again. He nodded, offering a polite smile but no further invitation. You look good, she said, scanning his face for something familiar, something she could pull on. I feel good, he answered truthfully. There was a beat of silence, the kind that used to feel heavy between them, full of unsaid things, but this time Evan felt no pressure to fill it. He let it be. I've been working on myself, Maya said, as if she needed to prove something. Trying to slow down, understand my patterns. That's good, Evan said, but there was no flicker in his eyes, no crack in his armor. She studied him. You seem different. I am. Maya opened her mouth to say more, but she hesitated. For the first time, she sensed that the emotional strings she used to tug on were no longer connected to anything. The Evan who once dropped everything at her tears now stood calmly, fully present in himself, unmoved by old cues. I just want you to know, I really did love you, she whispered. I know, Evan replied gently, but love without accountability becomes a weapon. And I won't be held hostage by that again. The words landed without malice. He didn't say them to hurt her. He said them because they were true, and truth no longer frightened him. It had become his shield, his compass. Maya nodded, and for a moment, Evan saw it, the dawning recognition in her eyes. She couldn't reach him anymore. Not with guilt, not with longing, not even with tears. And he didn't need to run from her anymore. He didn't need to explain himself or comfort her or revisit the past. He simply wished her well, turned toward the cashier with a book in hand, and walked away. As he stepped outside, the air felt lighter. His steps were steady. That invisible weight he'd carried for so long had finally fallen away. Not with a dramatic goodbye, but with the quiet decision to no longer participate in a story that only drained him. Emotional detachment wasn't coldness. It wasn't numbness. It was finally understanding the difference between holding space for someone and being consumed by them. It was the refusal to let guilt dress itself up as empathy. Evan had once believed that love meant endurance. Now he knew that love, real love, needed boundaries as much as it needed warmth. And for the first time, he wasn't chasing anyone. He was choosing himself. In the days that followed their last encounter, Evan didn't replay the moment in his mind. He didn't lie awake dissecting her expressions or second-guessing what he'd said. For once, there was no inner tug-of-war, no lingering doubt or emotional hangover. There was only peace, a quiet, liberating kind of stillness that felt unfamiliar, but profoundly welcome. Maya didn't reach out again. Whether it was pride, shame, or finally an understanding that her old patterns no longer worked on him, Evan didn't know. and he didn't need to. He no longer felt obligated to untangle her motives. For the first time in years, he didn't carry someone else's emotional weight. He began to notice how much space Maya had occupied in his life, how many of his choices had been reactions to her moods, rather than decisions made from his own clarity. The absence of her constant emotional pull made room for things Evan had neglected for too long. He found joy in small rituals again, early morning walks with his dog, cooking quiet dinners while jazz played in the background, taking long drives with no destination, simply because he could. People around him began to notice the change. His sister, who had always tiptoed around the topic of Maya, finally spoke up during a brunch. "You look lighter," she said, "like you've been underwater for years and just came up for air." Evan smiled, not because she was right, but because she didn't even know the half of it. It wasn't about moving on from Maya. It was about moving back into himself. He didn't dive into another relationship. He wasn't interested in filling the space she left behind with someone new. Instead, he started focusing on the parts of himself that had been muted: his creativity, his friendships, even his career. Evan had always been competent at work, but now he had energy and presence that he hadn't brought to the table in years. He stopped apologizing for taking time for himself. He no longer viewed self-care as selfishness, but as necessary maintenance for his emotional well-being. Meanwhile, Maya's presence faded quietly. Mutual acquaintances mentioned her in passing, how she had joined a meditation retreat, started therapy, or moved in with a new roommate. Evan didn't flinch when her name came up. There was no bitterness, no aching. Just a distant recognition, like remembering a song he used to love that no longer made him feel anything. The relationship hadn't been entirely meaningless. It had taught him lessons that no book or mentor ever could: how to recognize emotional manipulation, how to value reciprocal love, and most of all, how to stop mistaking emotional labor for connection. Maya had been the storm that taught him how to find his center. In time, Evan found himself walking through the world with a different posture. Shoulders relaxed, steps unhurried, heart unguarded, but no longer unprotected. He no longer chased intensity for the sake of feeling alive. He understood now that real love doesn't arrive in waves of chaos. It arrives with consistency, accountability, and care that doesn't come at the cost of one's own peace. One afternoon, as he sat at his favorite coffee shop reading, a woman at the next table asked what book he was lost in. They struck up a conversation. Easy, undemanding, genuine. When she laughed, it was light, uncalculated. Evan didn't feel the need to perform or measure his responses. He was just himself. And that, he realized, was the truest gift of the aftermath. Not just surviving the storm, but learning how to live in the calm without waiting for the next crash of thunder. He used to care too much. Now he cared just enough. For others, yes, but first and foremost for himself.